Most people imagine the world before the flood as a primitive place, a handful of people in animal skins, scattered, ignorant, waiting for civilization to begin. The truth runs the other way. What actually existed demanded cities, metalworking, music, and human beings who lived for nearly 1,000 years. This is the story they never told you about the world of the Nephilim. Picture the scene the book of Genesis lays out for you. The earth is young, but the people on it are not few, and they are not simple. 10 generations stretch from Adam to Noah, and across those 10 generations, human beings carry knowledge no single lifetime today could hold. You are about to walk through a world where a man could remember 9 centuries of history with his own eyes, where a single craftsman forged both bronze and iron, and where the line between the human and something stranger blurred until the entire order of creation came apart. 2 questions will follow you the whole way. The first, why a species that once lived close to 1,000 years was suddenly cut down to 120? The second, who the Nephilim truly were and what their presence did to the world that produced them. Start with time itself, because nothing about this world makes sense until you grasp how its people experienced it. Adam lived 930 years, according to Genesis chapter 5, verse 5. Seth, his son, reached 912. Jared lived 962. And Methuselah, whose name has survived into your own language as a byword for old age, lived 969 years, the longest recorded human life in the entire Bible. Set down in Genesis chapter 5, verse 27. Lamech, the father of Noah, lived 777 years. Noah himself reached 950. Sit with those numbers for a moment, because the human mind slides off them too easily. A modern life of 70 or 80 years feels complete. You watch children become grandparents. You see empires shift. Technologies replace themselves twice. Whole ways of living vanish. Now stretch that across 9.5 centuries. A man like Methuselah would have lived more than 12 times the length of an average life today. If you placed his single lifespan against the modern world, he could have been born before the printing press existed and still be alive to watch you read this. That is not a metaphor. That is the arithmetic of the world before the flood. Consider what that does to knowledge. In your world, a master craftsman trains for decades and dies, and much of what he knew dies with him. In that world, the master did not die. He kept refining the same craft for 3, 4, 5 centuries. Skills did not reset with each generation. They compounded. A metalworker could spend longer perfecting a single technique than the entire recorded history of the Roman Empire lasted. This is the first thing the popular picture gets wrong. These were not cavemen stumbling toward fire. These were people with the deepest reservoir of accumulated experience the human race has ever held, and they built with it. Genesis chapter 4 tells you that Cain, after he was sent away, did not wander aimlessly forever. He built a city, and he named it after his son, Enoch. Read that again and let the weight of it land. The very first city named in the Bible appears in the 7th verse of the 4th chapter. Only 1 generation removed from the first human family. Urban life, walls, permanence, a fixed place that gathered people together, was not a late invention in this telling. It came early, and it came from the line marked by the first murder. Trace the descendants of Cain, and the picture of a complex society sharpens with every name. Jabal, according to Genesis chapter 4, verse 20, became the father of those who live in tents and raise livestock. That single line describes the birth of an entire economy. Herding, mobile wealth, the domestication of animals on a large scale. His brother Jubal, in the very next verse, became the father of all who play the harp and the pipe. Music, not noise to frighten animals, but instruments, strings and wind. The deliberate organization of sound into art. A civilization does not invent the liar while struggling to survive. It invents the liar when it has the surplus, the leisure, and the sophistication to want beauty. Then comes the name that changes everything about how you should picture this world: Tubal-Cain. Genesis chapter 4 verse 22 names him as the forger of all tools of bronze and iron. Stop and weigh what that sentence is claiming. Bronze is not a natural metal. It is an alloy, a deliberate marriage of copper and tin in careful proportion. And to make it, you must first understand that two different metals, melted and combined, will produce a third that is harder than either. Copper alone melts only when you drive a furnace past 1080 degrees Celsius, hotter than any open campfire will ever reach. To work it, these people had to build furnaces, force air through them to raise the heat, control temperature, recognize ores in raw stone, and pour molten metal into molds without burning themselves alive. That is not primitive. That is industry. Now hold the human cost of that work in your hands, because the Bible names the achievement but says nothing of the price, and the price was always paid in flesh. Consider the metalworker bent over his furnace day after day. The heat alone would have been brutal. Standing close enough to molten bronze to pour it means standing in temperatures that scorch the skin and dry the eyes. Picture the lungs of a man who breathed metal smoke and fine ore dust for 200 years instead of 20. Picture the burns that never fully healed, layered one over another across decades. In your world, an industrial worker accumulates damage over a 40-year career and his body fails. Stretch that exposure across centuries of life and you begin to grasp a kind of slow suffering the text never describes, but the body could not have escaped. The longer life did not erase the cost of labor, it multiplied it. And the same was true of the herdsman, the builder, the woman bearing child after child, across hundreds of fertile years. Think about that last detail because it is easy to miss. If a woman remained capable of bearing children across even a fraction of a 900-year life, the number of descendants a single couple could produce becomes staggering. The earth, Genesis tells you, began to fill. Not with thousands. With a population that grew on a curve no modern nation has ever matched. Because both the lifespan and the childbearing years ran far longer than anything you know. The world before the flood was not empty. By the end, it was crowded, but the harp and the furnace are only the surface. Beneath the cities and the craft, something darker was taking shape, and this is where the second question that has been following you finally opens. Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 and 2. Makes a claim so strange that readers have argued over it for thousands of years. As humanity multiplied across the face of the earth, the text says, "The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took as wives any they chose." And then, in the fourth verse, comes the name that has haunted every reading of this passage since. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. The men of renown. Read the original weight of that phrase. These were the famous ones, the ones whose names traveled, the ones the ancient world remembered. Now understand the honest difficulty here, because faithfulness to the text means refusing to pretend the answer is simple. The Hebrew word, translated as Nephilim, is connected by many scholars to a root meaning to fall, or the fallen ones. Who exactly the sons of God were has never been settled. Some readers have understood them as the godly line of Seth intermarrying with the corrupt line of Cain. Others have read them as fallen spiritual beings, an interpretation echoed in ancient extra-biblical texts such as the Book of Enoch. And here you must be careful, because the Book of Enoch is not part of the Hebrew Bible, and its dramatic account of 200 fallen watchers descending to Mount Hermon is later tradition, not scripture. What Genesis itself states plainly is narrower and stranger than any single theory. That a union occurred which should not have occurred. That it produced offspring described as mighty, and that the world tilted toward ruin in their shadow. The text gives you the silhouette. It refuses to give you the full face. What Genesis does not leave ambiguous is the consequence. Look at the 3rd verse of chapter 6, and you find the answer to the first question that has been with you since the beginning. The Lord said that his spirit would not contend with man forever, for he is flesh, and his days would be 120 years. There it is, the collapse. A world where men measured their lives in centuries was placed under a ceiling of 120 years. The age of the near immortal was ending, and the verse that announces the Nephilim sits beside the verse that announces the shortening of human life, like a wound beside its cause. The connection is not stated as mechanism, but the order of the words is deliberate. And then the indictment arrives, and it is total. Genesis chapter 6, verse 5, delivers one of the most absolute condemnations in all of Scripture. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Not often evil, not mostly evil, only evil continually. The 11th verse adds the word that defines this world more than music or metal ever could. The earth was filled with violence. The Hebrew word is Hamas, corruption, cruelty, the strong devouring the weak. Picture what that means stretched across a civilization of near immortals. In your world, a tyrant rises, rules for a few decades, and dies, and his terror dies with him. Now imagine a violent man who does not die for 900 years. Imagine cruelty that compounds the same way craftsmanship compounded, refined across centuries by people who never lost their strength to age. The men of renown were not remembered for kindness. The world that produced cities and harps and bronze also produced a concentration of power and violence that had no expiration date, because the powerful simply did not pass away. That is the horror Genesis is describing. Not a primitive world, a sophisticated one that had turned its sophistication entirely toward ruin. Into that world, the text places one man, and it places him honestly. Noah was not a flawless hero standing above his neighbors by his own perfection. Genesis chapter 6 verse 8 says he found grace in the eyes of the Lord, and grace by definition is given, not earned. The 9th verse calls him righteous and blameless in his generation, a man who walked with God. But the Bible refuses to make him an idol. Later, in chapter 9, you will see this same man plant a vineyard, drink the wine, and lie drunk and exposed in his tent. The text shows you the deliverer of humanity at his lowest, because the writers of Genesis were never interested in painting heroes without shadows. Noah was a man given an impossible task in a doomed world. Measure the task itself, because the dimensions are recorded, and they are immense. God instructed Noah to build a vessel of gopher wood, and Genesis chapter 6, verse 15, gives you the exact measurements. 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. A cubit was roughly the length of a forearm, from the elbow to the tip of the middle finger, close to 45 centimeters or about 18 inches. Run the arithmetic and the arc stretches to something near 137 meters in length. That is roughly 450 feet, longer than 1.5 soccer fields laid end to end. Its width approaches 23 meters, and its height reaches close to 14 meters, the height of a modern 3-story building. Hold that against anything in the ancient world, and the scale becomes almost unbelievable. No wooden ship of remotely comparable size would be reliably documented again for thousands of years. The volume inside that hull, the carrying capacity, has been compared to hundreds of standard railroad stock cars. Picture a wooden box large enough to hold a train. Now picture one family building it by hand with the tools of their age in a world that had every reason to mock them. Because that is the part the text makes you feel, even when it does not say it directly. Noah built this enormous, useless-looking vessel on dry land, surrounded by a violent and crowded civilization that had never seen rain fall as judgment, and he kept building it year after year while they watched. Imagine the labor. Imagine felling and shaping enough timber to frame a structure the length of a city block, with no powered saw, no crane, no steel nail produced by a factory. Imagine sealing it watertight, inside and out, with pitch, as the 14th verse commands. Imagine the years of aching backs and torn hands, and the constant weight of being the household that everyone else considered insane. The physical cost was real, but the psychological cost may have been heavier. To labor without ceasing toward a catastrophe no one else believed was coming. And still, the text says, he did it. According to all that God commanded him, so he did. Then the world ended exactly as it had been warned. Genesis chapter 7 tells you that Noah was 600 years old when the waters came. The fountains of the great deep burst open, and the windows of the heavens were opened, and rain fell upon the earth for 40 days and 40 nights, according to the 12th verse. The waters rose until they covered the high mountains. And the 24th verse records that the waters prevailed upon the earth for 150 days. Everything that had breath in its nostrils on the dry land died. The cities, the furnaces, the harps, the men of renown, all of it went silent beneath the water. Silence. The entire accumulated achievement of a civilization that had lived for nearly 1,000 years per generation was erased in a matter of months. And the New Testament tells you exactly how many human beings survived. The first letter of Peter chapter 3 verse 20 states it plainly. 8 souls were saved through water. Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, and their 3 wives. Out of a world so full that the earth groaned under the weight of its population, 8 people walked out onto a cleansed and empty planet. 8. Consider the loneliness of that first day on dry ground. You stand on a transformed earth where every voice you had ever known besides the 7 beside you is gone. The world that had taken 10 generations and centuries of compounded knowledge to build no longer exists, and the long lives end with it. After the flood, the recorded ages begin their steady decline. Noah's descendants live shorter and shorter spans until human life settles into the brief measure you recognize today. The age of the near immortals closed, and it never reopened. That is the answer to the question that opened this story. The collapse from 9 centuries to 120 was not gradual decay. It was a verdict, announced before the flood and sealed by it. But the Nephilim leave one final shadow, and honesty requires you to follow it. Genesis chapter 6 said they were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. Centuries later, when Moses sent spies into the promised land, Numbers chapter 13 verse 33 records their terrified report. They had seen the Nephilim there, the descendants of Anak, and beside them the spies felt like grasshoppers. Whatever the Nephilim were, the memory of them outlived the flood in the dread of every generation that came after. The men of renown became the giants of legend, the figure that human beings across the ancient world could not stop telling stories about. Now stand back and look at the whole shape of it. The world before the flood was not the dim prologue to history that most people picture. It was a fully formed civilization, urban, musical, metalworking, populous and ancient beyond anything you can intuitively grasp. Its people held more accumulated knowledge than any society before or since, because death did not interrupt them for 9 centuries at a stretch, and precisely because they had so much time, so much skill, so much strength, their corruption ran deeper than corruption had ever run. The greatness and the violence grew from the same root. The longer they lived, the worse they became, until a world built by near immortals had to be unmade entirely. What survived was not the cities or the harps or the bronze. What survived was 8 people in a wooden box and the long human memory of a world that lost everything. There is a sober truth buried in that, and it belongs to believer and skeptic alike. The civilization of the Nephilim had every advantage a people could want: time, knowledge, art, and power, compounded across centuries. None of it saved them. The thing that endured was not their achievement, but the single thread of a family that kept walking when everyone else had stopped believing the rain would ever come. The world remembered the men of renown, but it was rebuilt by the 8 no one would have chosen to remember. That is the weight the story leaves in your hands. Greatness measured in centuries can vanish in 150 days, and what lasts is rarely what the world called mighty.